My boyfriend ignored my miscarriage until the male EMT said, "If she were mine, I'd hold her close." He lost it. I was 11 weeks pregnant when sharp, stabbing pains had me crying and bleeding in our bathroom while my boyfriend William was in bed playing on his Switch with headphones on. I had to crawl to the bedroom and physically shake him before he noticed. "Something's wrong with the baby," I sobbed, blood already soaking through my pajama pants. He pulled one earbud out. "What do you mean?" "I'm bleeding. Bad. I think I'm losing the baby." He sat up slowly, annoyed, like I'd interrupted something important. "Are you sure? Maybe it's just spotting. Google says that's normal." I was curled on the bathroom floor passing clots when he finally called 911. Not because he was worried, but because I was being dramatic, and he wanted professionals to tell me I was overreacting. He actually said that to the dispatcher. When the EMTs arrived, William was back in bed. They found me alone on the bathroom floor, covered in blood, shaking. The younger EMT, Diego, immediately knelt beside me while his partner got the stretcher. "Hey, I'm Diego. We're going to take care of you, okay?" His voice was so gentle. "Can you tell me how far along you are?" 11 weeks, I managed through tears. Was our first." Diego squeezed my hand while his partner took vitals. "I'm so sorry you're going through this. Is your partner here?" William appeared in the doorway, fully dressed, keys in hand. "I'm going to follow in my car. Hospital parking is expensive, and I might need to leave early for work." Diego looked at him like he'd grown a second head. "Your girlfriend is having a miscarriage." "Yeah, well, these things happen. First trimester and all that." William shrugged. "Probably wasn't meant to be." I started sobbing harder. Diego immediately shifted to block William from my view, creating a protective barrier with his body. "Let's focus on getting you comfortable," he said to me, then looked at his partner. "Can you grab extra blankets from the truck?" "She's in shock." As they lifted me onto the stretcher, Diego never let go of my hand. "I know this is devastating. You're being so strong." William followed us out, complaining about having to miss his buddy's poker night tomorrow because now we have to deal with this. He actually asked the EMTs how long miscarriages usually take, because he had a conference call at 9 a.m. In the ambulance, Diego sat beside me while his partner drove. William had already left in his car. Diego held my hand the entire ride, talking softly about anything except what was happening. His dog, the weather, a funny call from last week. When I started crying again, he didn't tell me to stop or that everything would be okay. He just said, "This is a loss. You're allowed to grieve." At the hospital, William was in the waiting room on his laptop. Diego wheeled me in and stayed while they transferred me to a hospital bed. When the nurse asked if my partner wanted to come back, William said he was good where he was, because the Wi-Fi was better in the waiting room. Diego was finishing his paperwork nearby. He looked at William, then at me, then back at William. "You know," he said, loud enough for the entire ER to hear, "I've responded to hundreds of miscarriages. The partners usually can't let go of their girlfriend's hand. They cry together. They grieve together." William finally looked up from his screen. Diego continued, adjusting his equipment bag. "If she were mine, I'd hold her close. I'd tell her it's not her fault. I'd make sure she knew she wasn't alone in the worst moment of her life." He paused. "But maybe I'm just old-fashioned about what love looks like." William slammed his laptop shut and stormed over. "Who the flock do you think you are?" "I'm the person who held your girlfriend's hand while she lost your baby," Diego said calmly. "You were checking work emails." "She's being dramatic. It's just a miscarriage." "Just a miscarriage?" I said from the bed. "It's our baby, William." He rolled his eyes. "It's not even a baby yet. It's like what, the size of a lime?" "Raspberry," Diego corrected quietly. 11 weeks is about the size of a raspberry." William turned on him. "How would you know that?" "Because I've had 3 miscarriages with my wife. I know every fruit size from blueberry to watermelon because we lost them at 8 weeks, 11 weeks, and 20 weeks. And every single time, I held her while she cried. I took time off work. I grieved with her." The entire ER had gone quiet. William's face was red, fists clenched. "Get away from my girlfriend." "Gladly." Diego looked at me. "You deserve better than someone who treats your loss like an inconvenience." That's when William fully snapped. He lunged at Diego, not caring how physically vulnerable I was, or how one wrong move would for sure kill our baby, and possibly even me. Security guards appeared from nowhere and grabbed William's arms mid-lunge, yanking him backwards so hard he stumbled. I screamed from the hospital bed, my voice coming out raw and broken as 2 more staff members rushed between William and Diego. The ER exploded into movement with nurses surrounding my bed and someone calling for the charge nurse while my whole body shook so hard the bed rails rattled. One nurse pressed her hand to my wrist, checking my pulse, while another adjusted the blood pressure cuff that suddenly felt too tight. My heart pounded in my ears and I couldn't stop shaking. Couldn't process that William had just tried to hurt someone right in front of me while I was bleeding and losing our baby. The head security guard positioned himself between William and the rest of us, his hand up in a stop gesture, while his partner kept a firm grip on William's shoulder. Diego stepped back with both hands raised in a calm, non-threatening position, his face neutral even though William was still yelling at him. The security guard asked Diego if he was hurt, and Diego shook his head no, his eyes briefly meeting mine with concern before looking away. William twisted against the guard's grip, his face red and splotchy as he shouted that Diego had disrespected him and everyone was taking my side. The partner pulled out a radio and reported the incident while the head guard took William's wallet from his pocket and wrote down his ID information. They told William he needed to wait in a separate area outside the ER, that he couldn't be near medical staff or patients right now. William's shouting got louder as they walked him toward the exit, his voice carrying back to where I lay frozen. He yelled that I was turning everyone against him, that this was all my fault for overreacting. His face was bright red with rage and something else, maybe embarrassment, as the automatic doors closed behind him. I felt my whole body go cold despite the heated blankets piled on top of me. I had just watched my boyfriend try to attack the person who held my hand while I lost our baby. The person who showed me more kindness in 2 hours than William had in 2 years. My teeth started chattering and I couldn't make them stop. The ER nurse came back to my bedside and placed her hand gently on my arm. She asked if I was okay while wrapping a fresh blood pressure cuff around my other arm. Her touch was so gentle it made me want to cry harder. She started an IV in my left hand, the needle pinch barely registering through everything else. She hung a bag of fluids and gave me something through the IV line for the pain, explaining they needed to do an ultrasound to see what was happening with the pregnancy. The medication made my head feel fuzzy but didn't touch the ache in my chest. She asked quietly who I wanted in the room with me during the exam. The question hung in the air between us. I realized with sudden sharp clarity that I didn't want William anywhere near me. Not now, maybe not ever. I told her I'd rather be alone and she nodded like this made perfect sense given what she'd just witnessed. She squeezed my hand and said she'd be right here the whole time. The ER doctor came in a few minutes later with a kind expression but serious eyes. She sat on the rolling stool beside my bed and explained that based on my symptoms and the amount of bleeding, I was likely having a miscarriage. Her voice was gentle, but she didn't sugarcoat anything. She outlined the next steps in simple terms I could understand through the fog. Ultrasound to confirm what was happening. Discussion of my options afterward. Blood work to check my hormone levels and something about my RH status that I didn't fully process. I tried to focus on her words but kept getting stuck on the phrase likely having a miscarriage. Like my brain couldn't move past it. My baby was probably already gone. My phone started buzzing on the tray table beside the bed. I picked it up and saw text after text from William. He said I was overreacting, that I'd embarrassed him in front of everyone, that the EMT had been out of line and I should have defended him, that people were staring at him in the waiting room. I stared at the messages that somehow made my physical pain and grief about his reputation. He didn't ask if I was okay or if the baby was okay, just complained about how this situation was affecting him. I set the phone face down without responding. The ultrasound tech arrived with her portable machine, a woman with gray hair and kind eyes. She was gentle and quiet as she squeezed gel onto my stomach and moved the wand across my belly. I watched her face while she looked at the screen. I saw it before she said anything. The way her expression shifted. Professional but sad. The doctor leaned in to look at the monitor and I heard her quiet sigh. The tech said softly that she was sorry, but there was no heartbeat. The doctor confirmed the pregnancy was not viable. I felt like I was falling through the bed into nothing. The room tilted and sounds got muffled like I was underwater. Someone was crying and it took me a second to realize it was me. The tech cleaned the gel off my stomach with warm towels while I stared at the ceiling tiles and tried to breathe. A different doctor arrived maybe 20 minutes later, introducing herself as Dr. Steele from OB/GYN. She pulled up a chair and sat at eye level with me instead of standing over the bed. She explained my 3 options in clear, straightforward language. I could wait for the miscarriage to happen naturally, which might take days or weeks. I could take medication to speed up the process, which would cause cramping and heavy bleeding at home. Or I could schedule a D&C procedure where they would remove the tissue surgically while I was under anesthesia. She explained each choice thoroughly, the risks and benefits of each approach. She mentioned they needed to check my blood type because of something called RH factor that could affect future pregnancies. She described what aftercare would look like for each option. I tried to focus through the fog of grief that made everything feel distant and unreal. Dr. Steele didn't rush me or make me feel like I needed to decide right away. I thought about going home and waiting, not knowing when it would happen, dealing with the physical pain on top of everything else. I thought about taking medication and going through it at the apartment I shared with William. I couldn't handle either of those options. I told Dr. Steele I wanted the D&C, that I wanted it scheduled as soon as possible. Tomorrow morning if they could do it. She squeezed my hand and said that was a completely valid choice. She said they would make sure I was comfortable and supported through the procedure. She would do the surgery herself and she'd take good care of me. A nurse came back to check my blood pressure and asked if I needed anything for pain. I told her the cramping was getting worse, and she added something to my IV that made everything feel softer around the edges. Diego was still at the nurse's station filling out forms on a clipboard, and when I looked over, our eyes met for just a second. He gave me this small nod that somehow said he understood everything without needing words. Then he picked up his equipment bag and headed toward the exit with his partner. He didn't come back to the bed or try to talk to me again, just acknowledged what happened and left, and I felt grateful he knew not to make it weird or complicated. 2 security guards in Navy uniforms came to my bedside about 10 minutes later with a tablet and started asking questions about what happened with William. They typed everything into their incident report while the charge nurse stood nearby with her arms crossed. When they finished, the nurse sat on the edge of my bed and said a police officer could come take my statement if I wanted to document what William did. I felt this pull in 2 directions, wanting to protect myself but also not wanting to make everything bigger and messier. The nurse must have seen me hesitate because she said I should at least hear my options, that I didn't have to decide anything right now, but it helped to know what was possible. I told her okay, and she made a call from the phone at the nurse's station. Officer Hines showed up around 8 that evening. A tall guy, maybe in his 40s, with kind eyes and a notepad. He pulled a chair right up next to my hospital bed instead of standing over me, and he asked me to describe what happened in my own words. I told him about William lunging at Diego, about security grabbing him, about all the texts calling me dramatic. Hines wrote everything down and nodded while I talked, never making me feel stupid or like I was overreacting. He explained that William's behavior toward medical staff was taken seriously, that attacking healthcare workers was a crime, and he gave me a pamphlet about protective orders if I needed one later. He said I didn't have to do anything tonight, but I should keep the information because sometimes these situations got worse before they got better. My phone started buzzing on the tray table after Hines left. I picked it up and saw text after text from William. He said I was being dramatic for getting him in trouble. He said I embarrassed him in front of everyone by making that EMT think he was a bad boyfriend. He said the security guards treated him like a criminal when he was just defending his relationship. I stared at the messages that somehow turned his attempt to attack someone into my fault, that made his violence about my behavior. He didn't ask if I was okay or if the baby was okay or what the doctor said, just complained about how this situation made him look bad. I held the phone in my hand for a long time, reading the texts over and over, and then I turned it completely off and set it face down on the table. The D&C happened the next morning in a surgical suite with bright lights and machines that beeped. Dr. Steele was there in scrubs explaining each step before they put me under, telling me what to expect when I woke up, making sure I understood the aftercare. The anesthesiologist put something in my IV and told me to count backward from 10. I made it to 7. When I woke up in recovery, the physical pain was less sharp than before, just a deep ache and cramping, but the emotional emptiness felt huge and overwhelming. A different nurse gave me detailed aftercare instructions on printed sheets, a list of support resources including grief counseling numbers, and a card with my follow-up appointment in 2 weeks. She asked if someone was picking me up and I said yes, even though I hadn't called anyone yet. I used the hospital phone to call May instead of William. She answered on the second ring and I started crying before I could say anything. She told me she was leaving work right now and would be there in 20 minutes. When she arrived at the recovery area, she took one look at my face and just hugged me carefully, avoiding my stomach. I told her I couldn't go back to the apartment I shared with William, that I couldn't be there with him after everything that happened. She said I was staying with her as long as I needed, no discussion, and she'd already texted her roommate to set up the guest room. The nurse helped me get dressed in the clothes I'd worn 2 days ago, now wrinkled and smelling like hospital, and May held my arm while we walked slowly to her car. The first night at May's apartment, I lay in her guest room staring at the ceiling, even though the pain medication should have knocked me out. The bed was comfortable with clean sheets that smelled like lavender detergent, but I couldn't stop my brain from replaying everything. The physical cramping reminded me my body was recovering from losing a baby, from having the pregnancy surgically removed, and the silence in the room felt both safe and suffocating at the same time. I could hear May moving around in the kitchen, the quiet sounds of someone trying not to disturb me, and I felt grateful and guilty in equal measure. May made eggs and toast for breakfast, setting a plate in front of me at her small kitchen table. She suggested blocking William's number while pouring coffee, saying it casual like she was mentioning the weather. I picked up my phone and looked at the settings screen, my finger hovering over the block button, but I could only bring myself to mute his notifications instead of cutting contact completely. May didn't push or tell me I was making a mistake. She just nodded and said I'd know when I was ready, and I appreciated that she wasn't forcing me to move faster than I could handle. Officer Hines called that afternoon while I was sitting on May's couch. He explained how to document any contact from William, walking me through the process of screenshotting texts and keeping a log with dates and times. He described how to request a protective order if William's behavior continued, what evidence I'd need, what the court process looked like. I wrote down everything he said in a notebook May gave me, feeling less helpless when I had concrete steps I could take instead of just waiting to see what William would do next. My manager called around 3 asking how I was doing, and I arranged medical leave using the note Dr. Steele had given me. I tried not to cry while explaining I needed time to recover physically and emotionally, that I wasn't sure exactly how long, but at least 2 weeks to start. The manager was understanding and said, of course, take the time I needed, but then mentioned they'd have to redistribute my projects to other team members. I felt guilty for creating problems at work, even though I knew logically this wasn't my fault, that losing a baby and dealing with everything that happened wasn't something I chose. The next morning I called the number Officer Hines had given me for therapists who take my insurance. The receptionist asked what I needed help with, and I had to pause because saying it out loud made it real again. I told her I lost a pregnancy and needed someone who understood that kind of grief, plus relationship stuff. She was quiet for a second in a way that felt kind instead of awkward, then said she had an opening with Gardenia Wallace next Tuesday if that worked. I wrote down the date and time in shaky handwriting, and when I hung up I felt like I'd done something right even though my hands were shaking. 2 hours later my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Dr. Steele's office wanted to schedule my follow-up appointment for 2 weeks out. The nurse went through a list of warning signs I should watch for. Heavy bleeding that soaked through more than 1 pad an hour. Fever over 100. 4 degrees. Severe pain that didn't respond to the medication they'd given me. I grabbed the notebook May had left on the coffee table and wrote everything down, adding the appointment to my calendar app with 3 separate reminders. Having these medical checkpoints marked felt like something solid I could hold on to when everything else kept shifting under my feet. 4 days after the miscarriage, I was lying on May's couch in sweatpants when the intercom buzzed. May was in the kitchen making lunch and I heard her answer it. Her voice changed immediately, going flat and firm in a way I'd never heard before. She told someone they needed to leave. My whole body went cold because I knew it was William even before she said his name. He was demanding to talk to me, his voice coming through the speaker angry and entitled like I was being unreasonable. May repeated that I wasn't available and he needed to leave the property. She didn't yell or get emotional, just stated it like a fact. I was frozen on the couch with my heart beating, so hard I thought I might throw up. William kept arguing through the intercom, saying this was ridiculous and I was being dramatic. May pressed the button one more time and said if he didn't leave, she was calling the police. Then she let go without waiting for his response. She came back into the living room and found me curled up with my knees to my chest. She sat down and pulled out her phone, opening her notes app. She typed in the date, time, and what happened, exactly like Officer Hines had told us to do. Then she asked if I was okay, and I nodded even though I wasn't, because what else could I say? That night I couldn't sleep again. I kept thinking about William standing outside the building, about how he'd shown up like he had a right to me. I got up around 2 a.m. and found the folder the hospital advocate had given me. Inside was information about therapy and support groups, plus the intake paperwork Gardenia's office had emailed me. One section asked about coping strategies and mentioned journaling as a way to process things. I found a blank notebook in May's guest room desk and opened it to the first page. I wrote the date at the top. Then I started writing about what happened, starting with the bathroom floor and the blood and William not noticing. The words came out messy and I had to stop 3 times to cry, but I kept going. I wrote about Diego holding my hand in the ambulance, about William trying to attack him in the ER, about losing the baby and feeling like my body had failed at the one thing it was supposed to do. When I finally stopped, my hand was cramping and I'd filled 6 pages. I felt raw and exhausted, but also like I'd let something out that had been trapped inside my chest. Tuesday came and I took the bus to Gardenia's office in a building downtown. The waiting room had soft gray walls and plants in the corners. A woman about my age came out and introduced herself as Gardenia, shaking my hand gently. Her office had a couch and a chair, warm lighting that wasn't too bright, and a box of tissues on the side table. She told me to sit wherever I felt comfortable, and I chose the couch. Then I just started crying. I couldn't help it. She didn't try to stop me or make it better, just sat quietly and pushed the tissue box closer. After maybe 10 minutes, I managed to say I didn't know where to start. She asked what brought me here, and I told her about the miscarriage, about William's reaction, about feeling like I was drowning. She listened without interrupting, nodding sometimes, but mostly just letting me talk. When I finally ran out of words, she said something that made me feel less crazy. She said losing a pregnancy isn't just losing what is. It's losing what you thought would be. All the future you'd already imagined. She said grief for that is real and valid. Then she handed me a worksheet about boundaries and said we'd work on this together. Looking at the questions on the page felt both obvious and like someone had just handed me a map I didn't know existed. 2 weeks after the DNC, I went back to Dr. Steele's office for the follow-up. The nurse took my blood pressure and temperature, asked about my bleeding and pain levels. Dr. Steele came in and did a quick exam, checking that everything was healing right. She said my physical recovery was going well, that my body was doing what it needed to do. Then she asked how I was doing emotionally and if I had support. I told her about staying with May and starting therapy. She asked if I was feeling guilty about the miscarriage, and I nodded because that feeling sat in my stomach all the time. Dr. Steele looked right at me and said firmly that nothing I did caused this. Not stress, not exercise, not anything. She said first trimester miscarriages usually happen because of chromosomal issues, problems that started at conception. We talked about fertility and whether I'd want to try again someday. She didn't push or make promises, just explained what the medical reality looked like. When I asked if my body would be able to carry a pregnancy in the future, she said probably yes, but there were no guarantees. I appreciated that she didn't try to make me feel better with fake reassurance. The next evening, May came into the living room where I was folding laundry and held out her phone. She'd screenshot a group chat with some of our mutual friends. William had written a long message about how the pregnancy wasn't a big deal since it was so early. He said I was being dramatic about what happened at the hospital. He claimed Diego had provoked him, and he'd just been defending himself. Reading his words made something shift in my chest, something that had been soft going hard. He was rewriting what happened, making himself the victim, erasing our baby like it had never mattered. I scrolled through the rest of the messages. A few people had pushed back gently, but most had just moved on to other topics. I handed the phone back to May and she asked if I was okay. I said I was done making excuses for him. I meant it. The next morning I called the police non-emergency line. I explained I needed to get my things from the apartment I'd shared with my ex, but I had a safety concern. The operator took my information and said someone would call me back. 3 hours later, my phone rang and it was Officer Hines. He remembered me from the ER and asked how I was doing. I told him I needed to get my documents and clothes from the apartment, but I was scared to face William alone. He said they could arrange a standby, where officers would be present while I collected my belongings. We set it up for the following Tuesday afternoon. He asked if I had somewhere to store everything, and I said yes. May had space. Hanging up, I felt my hands shaking, but also felt like I was taking control of something instead of just letting things happen to me. That afternoon, my manager called. She said she'd approved extending my medical leave another 2 weeks. I felt relief flood through me because I wasn't ready to go back yet. Then she mentioned they were concerned about some project deadlines, that my absence was creating problems for the team. I apologized and she said it was fine, these things happen, but I could hear the stress in her voice. After we hung up, I sat there feeling guilty for needing time to recover, Guilty for making work harder for other people. Guilty for everything. I knew logically that losing a baby and dealing with William wasn't something I chose. But knowing something logically and feeling it are different things. A few days later, I was making coffee in May's kitchen when she brought in the mail. She handed me an envelope forwarded from the hospital with my name on it. Inside was a card with a simple design, signed by the EMT department. It said they were thinking of me during this difficult time. I stared at it for a long moment. These people had seen me at my absolute worst, covered in blood and losing my baby. They didn't have to send anything. They'd already done their job. But they'd taken time to acknowledge what happened, to say they cared. I started crying, but it felt different from the other crying I'd been doing. This wasn't grief or anger. It was something else. Something about strangers being kinder than the person who was supposed to love me. That night, I sat at May's kitchen table with a blank page from a notebook and a pen that kept shaking in my hand. I started writing to the baby I'd lost, telling them about the nursery I'd imagined with soft yellow walls and the mobile with little stars I'd seen online. I wrote about how I'd planned to read to them every night and take them to the park on Sundays and teach them to bake cookies when they got older. I wrote that I was sorry I couldn't protect them, that my body had failed them, that they deserved better than what happened. The words poured out for 3 pages until my hand cramped and tears blurred the ink. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into my journal where no one would see it. Getting those thoughts out of my head and onto paper felt like setting down something heavy I'd been carrying since the hospital. The next morning, the hospital advocate called to schedule a meeting about safety planning. Her office was in the same building as the ER, but in a quieter wing with plants and soft chairs. She introduced herself and pulled out a folder with information about protective orders. She explained the process step by step, how to file the paperwork, what evidence would help, what the hearing would look like. She asked me to think through different scenarios where William might try to contact me and helped me plan responses for each one. She talked about changing my routines, varying my routes to work, being aware of my surroundings. Her tone was practical without being scary, treating this like a problem we could solve together with the right tools. She gave me a folder thick with resources and phone numbers and walked me through each document. When I left her office, I felt less helpless because I had concrete steps I could take. That night, I woke up gasping in May's guest room at 3 in the morning. In the nightmare, William had reached Diego, and it was my fault because I'd caused the confrontation by being dramatic. I sat up shaking and disoriented, not sure where I was for a few seconds. May knocked softly and asked if I was okay. I told her about the nightmare, and she made me tea and sat with me until my breathing slowed. In my next therapy session with Gardenia, I mentioned the nightmares. She taught me grounding techniques, having me name 5 things I could see, 4 I could touch, 3 I could hear. She explained that trauma doesn't follow a logical timeline, that my brain was processing what happened in the only way it knew how. She gave me tips for sleep hygiene and suggested keeping a small light on at night. The validation that my nightmares were normal helped somehow. Over the next few days, my phone kept buzzing with messages from mutual friends. William had posted vague things on social media about betrayal and false accusations. People were asking me what happened, if I was okay, if the stuff William was saying was true. I responded to 2 people with brief messages saying I wasn't discussing this and asking them to respect my privacy. Then I deactivated all my accounts because the attention felt like too much when I was trying to focus on healing. Logging out felt like closing a door on noise I didn't need. The court date for the protective order hearing arrived faster than I expected. I'd spent the week before preparing paperwork with Officer Hines' help over the phone. We outlined the hospital incident, William showing up at May's building, the emails he'd sent. Hines walked me through what to expect in the courtroom, who would be there, what questions the judge might ask. He reminded me I had documentation and witnesses. I was still nervous about facing William in court, but having Hines explain the process made it feel less scary. May took the morning off work to come with me. We sat in the courthouse hallway on a hard bench waiting for my case to be called. She told me a story about her cat knocking over a plant at 2 in the morning and the mess she'd woken up to. I laughed for the first time in days. Her presence steadied me when I started feeling shaky. I realized how important it was to have someone who just showed up without needing thanks or explanation. When we stood up to go inside, William was suddenly there in the hallway. He walked toward me with sad eyes and his hands out like he wanted to hug me. He started to say he was sorry and could we please talk. I remembered what the hospital advocate had told me about maintaining boundaries. I told him I couldn't talk to him and walked past him toward the courtroom. He called after me that I was being unreasonable. I had to fight the familiar urge to turn around and comfort him and explain myself. Inside the courtroom, the judge reviewed the hospital security report and the medical notes from Dr. Steele and my written statement. She asked me a few questions about the incidents and whether I felt unsafe. I answered as clearly as I could. William tried to interrupt twice, and the judge told him to wait his turn. After reviewing everything, she granted a 6-month protective order. William's face went bright red as the judge explained the terms, what he couldn't do, the consequences if he violated it. I felt both relief that I was protected and a weird letdown that this huge moment was over in 15 minutes. Outside the courthouse, my hands wouldn't stop shaking even though I'd gotten what I came for. May guided me to a bench in the sun where I could breathe. She didn't tell me it was over or that everything was fine. She just sat beside me while my nervous system caught up to the fact that I was safe. 3 days later, the police standby happened. 2 officers met me at the apartment William and I had shared. They waited by the door while I packed essentials into boxes and trash bags. I moved through the rooms quickly, grabbing clothes and documents and the few things that were just mine. In the bathroom, I opened the drawer to get my toothbrush and found a receipt for the prenatal vitamins I'd bought 2 months ago. I sat down on the bathroom floor and cried for 5 minutes while the officers waited patiently. Then I wiped my face, finished packing, and walked out the door without looking back at the apartment where I'd thought I was building a life. Breaking the lease took 3 visits to the landlord's office and a check for $800 that made my stomach hurt to write. I sat across from the property manager while she printed out the release forms and explained the early termination fee in detail, like I hadn't already read the lease a dozen times. My hand shook when I signed my name on the line, removing me from the paperwork. The manager stamped the documents and handed me a copy, and I walked out knowing I'd just paid nearly a month's rent to never see William again. Back at May's apartment, I spread out my bank statements on her kitchen table and stared at the numbers until they blurred. May came home from work and found me there, pulled up a chair and opened a budgeting app on her phone. She walked me through setting up categories for rent, food, medical bills, and eventually my own place. I watched the numbers organize into something manageable and felt proud of myself for choosing safety, even though it cost me money I didn't really have. Therapy with Gardenia the following week focused on patterns I'd been avoiding seeing. She asked me to describe a typical argument with William, and I started explaining how I'd always tried to stay calm so he wouldn't get more upset. Gardenia stopped me there and asked how often I'd minimized my own feelings to manage his emotions. I opened my mouth to defend myself and realized I'd been doing exactly that for years. She didn't make me feel stupid for staying or blame me for not seeing it sooner. She just helped me understand the pattern so I could recognize it and make different choices going forward. I left that session feeling like someone had turned on a light in a room I'd been stumbling through in the dark. The OB clinic lobby was busy when I arrived for my regular follow-up 2 weeks later. I checked in at the desk and found a seat near the window, flipping through a magazine without really reading it. Diego walked in carrying a to-go coffee cup and stopped short when he saw me. We both hesitated for a second before I stood up and crossed the small space between us. I thanked him for the kindness the EMT showed me that night, keeping it general and not making it weird. He smiled and said they were just doing their job, then mentioned his wife had an appointment here too, which explained why he was in the building. The way he said it felt natural rather than pointed, and I appreciated that he wasn't trying to be my hero or my friend. We talked for maybe 2 minutes before his wife came out of the restroom and he excused himself. I sat back down feeling okay about the encounter, like we'd acknowledged what happened without making it into something bigger than it needed to be. May helped me load the baby items into her car the next Saturday morning. I'd only bought a few things before the miscarriage, a pack of onesies and a stuffed elephant and some books I'd been excited about reading someday. We drove them to a pregnancy support organization downtown and carried the bag inside together. The volunteer at the desk thanked us and asked if we wanted a receipt for taxes, and I said no, because I didn't want documentation of this loss sitting in a file somewhere. Back at May's apartment, we lit a candle on her coffee table and sat on the couch watching it flicker. It was a small ritual that acknowledged what I'd lost without trying to make it mean something bigger than it was. May didn't say anything profound or try to find a silver lining. She just sat with me while the candle burned down, and I felt grateful she understood I needed to mark this without drama. My first day back at work was a Monday morning 3 weeks after the miscarriage. My manager had created a ramp-up plan starting with easier projects to rebuild my confidence. I sat at my desk opening emails and reviewing spreadsheets while my coworkers welcomed me back with careful smiles. The project I started was straightforward data entry that didn't require much creative thinking. Around 2 in the afternoon, I felt tears building and had to lock myself in the bathroom for 5 minutes. I splashed cold water on my face and went back to my desk. At 4 o'clock, I nearly cried again when a coworker asked how I was doing in that careful tone people use when they know something bad happened. I made it through the whole day and felt a tiny bit of normalcy returning to my routine. The email from William arrived Wednesday morning from an address I didn't recognize. He asked if we could talk and complained that the protective order was making his life difficult. My hands started shaking as I read it, but I remembered the safety plan Officer Hines had helped me create. I took a screenshot of the email without responding, opened a new message to Hines, and forwarded everything with a brief note about the violation. My heart raced while I clicked send, but I also felt proud that I'd followed the plan instead of engaging with William's manipulation. HR called me in for a meeting the next day to update my emergency contacts and discuss building security. I removed William's name from every form and added May instead. The HR representative explained they were adjusting my building access badge and that security would get William's photo, so they could prevent him from entering the workplace. We walked down to the security desk together where I pulled up a photo of William on my phone. The guard made a copy and added it to their system. These practical measures made me feel slightly safer, even though I hated needing them in the first place. Gardenia noted progress in our next therapy session. She pointed out that my hypervigilance was decreasing based on what I described about sleeping better and not jumping at every sound. We talked about moving to appointments every other week instead of weekly. The progress felt fragile but real, and I was learning to trust that healing didn't have to be linear to be happening. She gave me homework about identifying my needs versus others' expectations, and I left feeling like I was building something sustainable rather than just surviving. My final OB follow-up with Dr. Steele happened on a Thursday afternoon. She did an exam and reviewed my lab results, then told me everything looked good, and there were no complications from the miscarriage. She cleared me medically while acknowledging that the emotional recovery would take longer than the physical healing. She asked if I had support for the grief piece, and when I mentioned therapy with Gardenia, she nodded and said that was exactly what she wanted to hear. She wished me well as I left, and I felt a chapter closing, even though I knew the story wasn't over. May's lease renewal notice came in the mail the following week. We were sitting on her couch when she opened it and mentioned she needed to decide about staying another year. I offered to increase my contribution to rent, signaling that I was planning to stay longer term rather than finding my own place right away. She accepted without making a big deal about it, and we joked about being roommates like we were in college again. Underneath the humor was the serious reality that she'd given me stability when I needed it most, and I was grateful to have a place where I felt safe while I figured out the rest of my life. Officer Hines called the following week while I was at May's apartment folding laundry. He explained that the prosecutor had reviewed William's case but decided not to file additional charges beyond the protective order violation warning. I felt my chest tighten with frustration as he talked, disappointed that William faced such limited consequences for everything he'd done. Hines walked me through the legal reality of what they could actually prove in court, explaining that emotional abuse and being a terrible partner weren't crimes, even though the hospital incident was documented. I appreciated his honesty instead of making false promises about justice, and I thanked him for following up personally when he didn't have to. He reminded me the protective order was still in place, and to keep documenting any violations, then wished me well before hanging up. I sat there staring at my phone for a few minutes, processing the anger and disappointment before going back to the laundry. The pregnancy loss support group met Thursday evenings at a community center across town. I drove there the next week, walking into a room with folding chairs arranged in a circle and 8 other women already seated. The facilitator introduced herself and explained the format where we'd go around sharing our stories and feelings. I listened to the first few women talk about their losses, noticing how the structure felt too formal and the sharing too prescribed for what I needed right now. When my turn came, I gave a brief version of my miscarriage without mentioning William or the ER drama, and the facilitator asked probing questions about my support system that felt invasive. After the meeting ended, I drove home knowing I wouldn't return. Individual therapy with Gardenia was working better for me, and I didn't feel guilty about that choice because I was learning that different people heal differently. I texted May that I'd tried the group, but it wasn't my thing, and she responded with a thumbs up and no pressure. I spent Saturday morning at May's kitchen table drafting a thank you note to Diego for his compassion during the worst night of my life. I wrote and rewrote it several times, trying to express gratitude without being weird or crossing boundaries. The final version was simple, thanking him for his kindness and professional care, acknowledging how much his compassion meant during a traumatic experience. I addressed it to the hospital's general feedback system, rather than trying to contact him directly, finding their online form and submitting it through proper channels. It felt important to express gratitude while respecting the boundaries he'd maintained throughout everything. I hoped he would see the feedback and know his kindness mattered, even if I never heard back. Clicking submit gave me a small sense of closure, like I'd honored something important without making it complicated. My work required CPR certification renewal, so I signed up for a public class at the community center 2 weeks later. I walked into the training room and immediately recognized Diego at the front setting up practice dummies. My stomach flipped, but I took a seat in the back row, hoping to avoid awkward interaction. During the morning break, he approached me with a friendly smile and asked how I was doing. I told him I was managing, that I had good support and was in therapy. He nodded and said he was glad to hear it, then mentioned his wife was pregnant again, which made me genuinely happy for him. I congratulated him and asked when they were due, and we chatted briefly about his excitement mixed with normal pregnancy anxiety. The conversation felt grounded in mutual respect, rather than anything complicated or charged. When the break ended, we returned to our spots, and I felt okay about the encounter, like we'd acknowledged our connection without making it into something it wasn't. My next therapy session with Gardenia focused on untangling my feelings about Diego. She helped me understand that my attraction to him was really about feeling safe and seen during trauma, not about him specifically as a person. We talked about the difference between genuine connection and trauma bonding, between real attraction and the desperate need to be rescued. She asked me to consider what Diego represented in that moment, how his basic human decency had felt like heroism, because William's cruelty was my normal. Something clicked as we discussed releasing the fantasy of being rescued, and building my own sense of security instead. I realized I'd stayed with William for so long partly because I kept hoping he'd transform into someone who cared, waiting to be saved instead of saving myself. Gardenia gave me homework about identifying moments when I'd given away my power and how to reclaim it. I left the session feeling like I'd understood something fundamental about my patterns. Apartment hunting became my focus over the next few weeks. I found a small studio closer to work, nothing fancy but clean and affordable with my own kitchen and bathroom. I used the savings I'd been keeping separate from William, plus a loan from my parents who were relieved I was finally leaving him completely. May helped me move in on a Saturday, loading her car with my belongings from her guest room, and the few things I'd retrieved from the old apartment. We made 3 trips, carrying boxes up 2 flights of stairs and arranging furniture in the tiny space. Having my own place with locks only I controlled felt like reclaiming something essential about myself. May ordered pizza for dinner, and we sat on my new floor eating from the box, joking about my minimalist setup. After she left, I stood in the middle of my empty studio and felt proud of myself for getting here. Closing the joint bank account with William required one last interaction through email. I logged in and saw we had one final shared bill to pay, then drafted a message about splitting it and closing everything. William responded with a dispute about who owed what, claiming I'd used more utilities the last month, which was ridiculous since I'd moved out. We went back and forth through terse emails for 2 days before I just paid the extra $20 myself to be done with it. The annoyance of dealing with financial loose ends was nothing compared to the relief of finally being financially separate. I transferred my half of the remaining balance, closed my access to the account, and deleted all his payment apps from my phone. Seeing those apps disappear from my screen felt like erasing another connection between us. I reactivated my social media accounts after 2 months of being offline, but I set much tighter privacy settings and made a clear policy about not discussing the miscarriage or breakup publicly. A few people immediately messaged asking what happened with William and if I was okay. I declined to answer the intrusive questions with a simple response that I was handling things privately. Some people pushed harder, wanting details or offering unsolicited advice, and I was surprised by how okay I was with disappointing their curiosity. I unfollowed anyone who made me feel obligated to explain myself and kept my feed limited to close friends and family. Being back online felt manageable now that I'd learned to protect my boundaries even in digital spaces. The date circled on my calendar arrived in early summer. It would have been my due date, the day I would have met my baby if everything had gone differently. I took the day off work without explaining why, just marking it as personal time. I spent the morning alone in my studio, lighting the same candle I'd used before, and reading the letter I'd written to the baby months ago. I let myself cry without trying to stop or analyze it, just sitting on my floor grieving what I'd lost. May texted around lunch to check on me but didn't hover or demand details, just sent a heart emoji and said she was around if I needed anything. I appreciated having space to grieve in my own way, to mark this private milestone without performance or explanation. By evening, I felt emptied out but also lighter, like I'd honored something important. My first major project since returning to work wrapped up the following week. I'd been slowly rebuilding my confidence and workload, and this project felt like proof I could handle my job again. My manager called me in for our quarterly review meeting, and she praised the quality of my work and attention to detail. She mentioned increased responsibilities in the next quarter, potentially leading a small team on a new initiative. I felt a surge of confidence that I could handle more, that everything that had happened hadn't broken my ability to be good at my job. Walking back to my desk after the meeting, I realized I was starting to see a future again, instead of just surviving each day. A thick envelope arrived at my studio apartment 3 weeks later, with a law firm's return address, and I opened it standing in my kitchen to find a typed letter from William's lawyer. The apology was brief and formal, stating that William regretted the incident at the hospital and acknowledged his behavior was inappropriate during a difficult time. I read it twice looking for anything that felt genuine, but the language was clearly drafted by his attorney to satisfy the protective order requirements rather than coming from any real remorse. The letter mentioned nothing about the baby we lost or the months of emotional neglect that led up to that night. I folded it back into the envelope and filed it in the folder with all the legal documents, feeling nothing except maybe relief that I didn't feel obligated to respond. Gardenia had talked with me about how forgiveness isn't something I owe anyone, especially not someone who hurt me, and then apologized only because a judge made him. I closed the file drawer and went back to making dinner, surprised by how little the letter affected me compared to how much William's opinion used to matter. May mentioned over lunch the following week that her coworker had a friend who was recently single and wondering if I'd be interested in meeting for coffee. I felt my stomach tighten with anxiety, but also curiosity about whether I was ready to even think about dating again. May was careful not to push, saying it would just be casual and low pressure, maybe just a chance to practice talking to someone new. I agreed mostly because I trusted May's judgment and figured I could handle one coffee without it meaning anything serious. The guy's name was Jason, and we met at a cafe near the park on a Saturday afternoon, sitting outside at a small table. He was nice enough and we talked about work and hobbies and the city, but I kept noticing how I wasn't nervous or excited, just going through the motions of polite conversation. There was no spark or connection beyond basic friendliness, and I could tell he felt the same way. We finished our coffee after about an hour and said it was nice meeting each other, both of us clearly relieved there was no pressure to pretend otherwise. Walking back to my car, I felt okay about the whole thing instead of disappointed or worried that something was wrong with me. I was learning to trust my instincts about people and not force connections just to prove I was moving on from William. Some coffee dates are just coffee dates, and that's perfectly fine. That evening, I took out my journal from the drawer beside my bed and flipped to the letter I'd written to the baby months ago. I lit the candle I kept on my nightstand, the same one I'd used before, and sat cross-legged on my floor reading the words I'd poured out about hopes and dreams and sorrow. The grief washed over me again, but it felt different now, less sharp and overwhelming, more like something I could hold without it destroying me. I let myself cry without trying to stop or analyze why or tell myself I should be over it by now. The tears came and I sat with them, remembering the tiny life that had existed inside me for 11 weeks, and all the future moments we'd never have together. The candle flickered in the quiet of my apartment, and I felt the weight of the loss, but also the strength of having survived it. The grief hadn't disappeared and probably never would completely, but it had changed shape into something I could carry alongside the rest of my life, instead of something that crushed me under its weight. I closed the journal and blew out the candle, feeling emptied out but also somehow lighter. 6 months after that terrible night in the ER, I was sitting in my own apartment on a Friday evening with my laptop open, finishing up some work emails. The protective order against William was still in place with 4 months remaining, and I hadn't heard from him since his lawyer's letter. My bank account showed steady paychecks and growing savings, proof that I could manage my finances independently without anyone else controlling them. May had texted earlier asking if I wanted to grab dinner tomorrow, and I had regular therapy appointments with Gardenia every other week that helped me process everything. My manager had given me more responsibility at work, and I was handling it well, my confidence slowly rebuilding after months of feeling like I couldn't trust my own judgment. The studio apartment was small, but it was mine, with locks only I controlled and furniture I'd chosen, and a safety I'd built intentionally, rather than by accident. I wasn't all the way healed and probably never would be completely, carrying the grief of losing my baby and the scars from William's treatment. But I was safe now, supported by people who actually cared about my well-being, and learning that being okay was enough to build a future on. The life I was creating wasn't perfect or dramatic or tied up with a neat bow, just stable and mine and moving forward one day at a time.